The space station Concordia floated in the darkness between three star systems, a neutral ground where species who did not trust each other could meet and talk without fear of attack. At least that was what the Galactic Union promised when they built it 200 years ago. And so far, that promise had held true for every diplomatic meeting that took place within its silver walls, Elena. Marsh stood in the corner of the negotiation chamber with her back against the cold metal wall and her eyes moving slowly across every face in the room. She was 34 years old, trained in close protection work since she was 22. And she had guarded diplomats on 11 different worlds without ever losing one of them to violence or kidnapping today. She was assigned to Ambassador Paul Hendricks, a tall man with gray hair and a calm voice who had spent 30 years talking to aliens and finding ways to make peace where others saw only war. He sat at the long table in the center of the room, his hands folded in front of him as he listened to the Velith delegation explain why humanity did not deserve mining rights in the outer reach territories. The Velith were reptilian in appearance, with scaled skin that shifted between green and blue depending on their mood, and eyes that never seemed to blink. They moved with a strange precision that made Elena uncomfortable, as if every step and every gesture had been calculated in advance by some invisible machine inside their head's commander. Thravik led the Velith delegation, and he was the largest of his kind that Elena had ever seen. His scales were darker than the others, almost black in certain light. And when he spoke, his voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never been proven wrong about anything in his entire life. "Your species is young," Thravik said, his words translated instantly by the device on the table. "And your technology is primitive compared to ours. The outer reach contains resources that require advanced extraction methods, and we do not believe humans are capable of operating at that level." Ambassador Hendricks nodded slowly and kept his expression neutral, a skill he had perfected over decades of dealing with species who looked down on humanity. "We have engineers who would disagree with that assessment," Hendricks replied, "but I understand your concern. Perhaps we could discuss a joint operation where both our species contribute resources and expertise." Thravik made a sound that might have been laughter, though it was hard to tell with Velith facial expressions. "Joint operations require trust," Thravik said, "and trust requires proof of capability. Your species has been part of the Galactic Union for only 60 years. And in that time, you have contributed very little to our understanding of advanced warfare or scientific progress." Elena watched the exchange without moving, her face as blank as the metal wall behind her. She had heard this kind of talk before on other worlds, this casual dismissal of everything humanity had achieved. And she had learned long ago that arguing with aliens, who had already made up their minds, was a waste of breath. Revik's eyes moved away from the ambassador and settled on Elena for the first time since the meeting began. His gaze dropped to her waist, where two revolvers hung in leather holsters that looked older than most of the technology on the station. "What are those?" Thravik asked, pointing one clawed finger at the weapons. Elena did not answer immediately, waiting to see if the ambassador wanted to handle the question. But Hendricks simply glanced at her and gave a small nod. "They are called revolvers," Elena said, her voice flat and professional. "Projectile weapons that fire metal rounds using a chemical propellant." Thravik stared at the revolvers as if Elena had just told him she was carrying rocks tied to sticks. "Chemical propellant," he repeated. And this time, the sound he made was definitely laughter. "Commander Veth, are you recording this?" "The human security officer carries weapons that belong in a museum." The other Velith at the table made similar sounds of amusement, their scales shifting to a lighter shade of blue that Elena guessed meant they found something funny. "Our predictive combat systems can analyze any weapon in the galaxy," Thravik continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "We calculate projectile speed, firing patterns, reload intervals, and optimal counter movements in less than 1 second. Your primitive revolvers would be useless against even our youngest soldiers. Elena said nothing, keeping her hands relaxed at her sides and her breathing steady. She had heard worse insults from better enemies, and she was not going to let a lizard in a fancy uniform get under her skin. The Valith have not lost a ground engagement in 300 years, Thravik added, clearly enjoying the sound of his own voice. Our combat theory is perfect because it is based on mathematics, not instinct. Every variable is accounted for, every outcome is predicted, and every enemy is defeated before they even realize the fight has begun. Ambassador Hendricks cleared his throat softly, drawing attention back to the negotiation. Perhaps we could return to the matter of the mining rights, he suggested. I believe there is still room for compromise if both sides are willing to consider alternative arrangements. Thravik turned back to the ambassador, apparently satisfied that he had made his point about human inferiority. Very well, he said. Let us discuss what your species might offer that would convince us to share the outer reach. The negotiation continued for another hour, with both sides making proposals and counter-proposals that seemed to go nowhere. Elena remained in her corner, watching and waiting, her hands never straying far from the revolvers that the Valith found so amusing. She had carried these weapons since she was 18 years old, a gift from her mother, who had received them from her mother before her. The revolvers had been in her family for over a century, passed down from woman to woman along with the knowledge of how to use them properly. They were simple weapons, Elena knew, with no targeting computers or energy cells or any of the advanced features that alien species considered essential. But simple did not mean weak, and old did not mean useless. And someday the Valith might learn that lesson the hard way. A sharp alarm cut through the air without warning, a sound that made everyone in the room freeze in place. Red lights began flashing along the walls of the negotiation chamber, and a voice came through the station's communication system with words that Elena had hoped she would never hear. Attention all personnel, this is station control. Unknown vessels have surrounded Concordia and are refusing to respond to communication attempts. All diplomatic delegations are advised to remain in their current locations until further notice. Thravik rose from his seat, his scales shifting to a dark shade that Elena guessed meant anger or alarm. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, looking around as if someone in the room might have answers. Elena stepped away from the wall and moved closer to Ambassador Hendricks, her right hand dropping to rest on one of her revolvers. Ambassador, she said quietly, I think the negotiations just became a lot more complicated. Through the observation window at the far end of the chamber, Elena could see the shapes of ships moving against the stars, more ships than a simple pirate raid would require. And she felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized that whatever was about to happen would test everything she had ever learned about survival. Elena moved forward with both revolvers raised, and the first Karath to come at her learned the hard way that size and aggression did not always equal victory. She fired twice with her right hand, the shots coming so fast they sounded like one continuous roar. And the alien dropped to the floor before it could take another step. The Valith soldiers behind her stopped retreating, their eyes fixed on the human woman who was walking toward the breach point instead of away from it. Ravik watched his tactical display flash error messages across the holographic screen. The system was trying to analyze Elena's movements, trying to find a pattern in the way she held her weapons or the angle of her shots or the rhythm of her steps. But there was no pattern to find. She fired the left revolver at a Karath crouching behind a piece of fallen debris, and the shot passed through a gap so small that the predictive system had calculated only a 3% chance of a bullet making it through. Elena had not calculated anything at all. She had simply seen the gap and trusted her hand to find it. Two more Karath rushed her from different angles, thinking they could overwhelm her with speed and numbers. but Elena was already spinning to meet them. She dropped low as one blade swept over her head, fired upward into the chest of the attacker, then rolled sideways and came up shooting at the second enemy who had expected her to keep moving in a straight line. The Korath fell, and Elena kept moving. She did not use cover the way the Valeth soldiers had been trained to use it, pressing against walls and leaning out at calculated intervals. Instead, she moved between cover points with a randomness that made no tactical sense on paper, but made perfect sense in the chaos of real combat. At Korath, with a projectile weapon, tried to track her movements, his alien eyes following her across the room as he adjusted his aim again and again. But she never stayed in one place long enough for him to fire. When he finally pulled the trigger out of frustration, Elena was already somewhere else, and his shot punched a hole in an empty wall. She killed him with a single round through the throat, then turned and fired twice more at enemies she should not have been able to see. One bullet ricocheted off a metal beam and struck a Korath who was trying to flank her position, and the other caught an alien in mid-leap as it jumped down from an elevated platform. Thervik could not understand what he was seeing. His system was tracking every bullet Elena fired, and some of them should have been impossible. Angles that defied logic and timing that suggested she knew where her enemies would be before they arrived there. "How is she doing this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the gunfire. One of his soldiers, a young Valeth named Keth, who had survived the initial breach, shook his head slowly. "She's not calculating," Keth said, his voice filled with something that sounded almost like religious awe. "She is just acting, moving on instinct without any system to guide her. Our ancestors spoke of creatures like this in the old myths, beings who fought without thought or hesitation." Elena ran out of ammunition in her right revolver, and instead of retreating to reload, she did something that made Thravik's tactical display completely freeze. She threw the empty weapon at the nearest Korath with enough force to crack the alien's skull, then used the distraction to close the distance while reloading her left revolver with practiced speed. The Korath, who recovered from the thrown weapon, found a fresh barrel pointed at his face, and Elena pulled the trigger before he could raise his blade. She picked up her other revolver from the floor next to the body, reloaded it without looking, and fired twice more at targets that were trying to retreat back through the breach point in less than 2 minutes. The attack was over. The floor of the negotiation chamber was covered with Korath bodies, at least 15 of them scattered across the room in positions that showed just how desperately they had tried to get away from the human woman with the primitive weapons. Elena stood in the center of the carnage with both revolvers still raised, her eyes scanning for any movement, her breathing slightly faster than normal but still under control. Blood that was not hers dripped from a cut on her left arm where a blade had come close enough to slice through her jacket. But she did not seem to notice or care. The surviving Valeth soldiers stared at her in silence, their weapons lowered, their predictive systems still trying to process what had just happened and failing completely. Commander Thravik walked forward slowly, stepping over bodies as he approached Elena. And for the first time since she had met him, his voice carried no arrogance or condescension. "How did you know where they would be?" he asked, his scales shifting to colors that Elena did not recognize. "How did you know which way they would move or where they would attack from?" "My system could not predict any of it, but you seem to know everything." Elena lowered her revolvers and let out a long breath. "I did not know," she said simply. "I guessed, and I trusted myself to be right." Thravik shook his head, his eyes moving across the bodies on the floor. "That is impossible," he said. "Combat is mathematics. It is patterns and predictions and calculated responses. What you did should not have worked." Elena holstered her weapons and turned to check on Ambassador Hendricks, who was slowly rising from behind the negotiation table with a look of stunned amazement on his face. "Your problem," Elena said over her shoulder, is that you think fighting is about knowing what will happen next. But real fighting is about making your enemy think one thing while you do something else entirely. You cannot predict that with any system because there is nothing to predict. Just a human being making choices in the moment based on feelings you cannot measure. Thravik stood in silence for a long moment, staring at the bodies around him and thinking about 300 years of Valith military doctrine that had just been proven inadequate by a single human with 2 antique revolvers. The station's alarm was still blaring, and Elena knew that the danger was far from over. There were hundreds more Korath aboard Concordia, and sooner or later they would send reinforcements to this corridor. "We need to move," she said, a voice carrying the same authority that Thravik had used at the start of the negotiation. "The shuttle bay is 3 levels down. If we can get there before the Korath block all the escape routes, we might have a chance of getting off this station alive." Thravik nodded slowly, and for the first time he did not argue or dismiss her words. "Lead the way," he said. And those 3 simple words meant more to Elena than any medal or commendation she had ever received. She checked her revolvers one more time, making sure both were fully loaded, then moved toward the emergency exit at the back of the chamber. "Stay close," she told the group. "And when the fighting starts again, do not think too much. Just move and react, and trust that you know more than any computer ever could." The Volith soldiers looked at each other with uncertain expressions, but they followed her anyway, because for the first time in 300 years, they had seen something their perfect systems could not explain. And that something had kept them alive. The alarm continued to scream through the corridors of Concordia, as Elena moved Ambassador Hendricks away from the observation window and toward the center of the room, where the thick negotiation table could provide some cover if things went bad quickly. Commander Thravik was already shouting orders to his soldiers in the harsh clicking language of the Valith, and Elena watched as 6 reptilian warriors took up positions around the chamber with their advanced energy rifles held ready. Their movements were precise and coordinated, each soldier stepping into place as if they had rehearsed this exact scenario 1,000 times before. "What is happening?" Ambassador Hendricks asked, his calm voice now carrying an edge of genuine concern. Elena shook her head slightly, her eyes never stopping their movement across the room and toward every possible entry point. "I do not know yet," she admitted, "but those ships out there are not Galactic Union vessels, and they are not responding to communication attempts, which means they are either here to take something or destroy something." The station shuddered suddenly, a deep vibration that Elena felt in her bones, and she knew that sound all too well. Somewhere on Concordia, hull breaches were being forced open by boarding parties. "Korath raiders," one of the Valith soldiers announced, reading information from a device attached to his wrist. "Multiple breach points detected on levels 7 through 12. Station security forces are engaging, but reporting heavy casualties." Thravik hissed something in his own language that Elena suspected was a curse. "Korath," he repeated in the common tongue. "Pirates and scavengers who attack diplomatic vessels for ransom and supplies. They have no honor and no pattern to their tactics." Elena filed that information away in her mind. No pattern meant chaos, and chaos was something she understood better than most. "How many breach points?" she asked the Valith soldier directly. The soldier looked at Thravik as if asking permission to answer a human, and Thravik gave a short nod. 17 confirmed breaches," the soldier replied. With an estimated 400 Korath combatants now aboard the station, Elena did the math quickly in her head. The negotiation wing was on level 10, which meant the enemy was already on their floor somewhere. And with only 6 Valith soldiers, plus herself to protect both delegations, the numbers were not in their favor. "We need to move," Elena said, looking at Thravik. "This room has too many entry points and only one exit." If they surround us here, we will have no options. Thravik's scales shifted to a darker shade, and Elena could see that he did not appreciate taking suggestions from a human. My soldiers will hold this position, Thravik declared. Our predictive combat systems are already analyzing Korath weapon signatures and movement patterns. We will know exactly where they are and what they will do before they even reach this corridor. As if to prove his point, Thravik activated a holographic display that appeared in the air above the table, showing a map of the surrounding corridors with red dots indicating enemy positions. The dots were moving in what looked like random directions, some clustering together and others spreading out with no apparent logic. There, Thravik said, pointing to a group of dots approaching from the east corridor. 12 hostiles will reach the main door in approximately 90 seconds. My soldiers will eliminate them before they can breach the chamber. The Veilith soldiers adjusted their positions, their rifles aimed at the sealed door, and Elena watched the confidence in their posture with growing unease. They were too certain, too convinced that their technology would protect them from whatever came through that door. Something is wrong, Elena said quietly. More to herself than anyone else, Thravik heard her anyway, and made that dismissive sound again. What could possibly be wrong? He asked. We know exactly where the enemy is and exactly what weapons they carry. The moment they enter this room, they will be facing calculated fields of fire designed to eliminate them with maximum efficiency. Elena watched the red dots on the holographic display, and she finally understood what was bothering her. The dots were not moving in patterns because there were no patterns. Just random motion driven by instinct and aggression and the simple desire to kill and take whatever they wanted. Your systems need patterns to work, Elena said. And now Thravik was looking at her with something that might have been irritation. But these pirates are not using patterns. They are attacking like animals, going wherever they feel like going and doing whatever occurs to them in the moment. Thravik waved one clawed hand dismissively. Chaos is still predictable on a large enough scale, he insisted. My systems will adapt and compensate. They always do. The door at the east end of the chamber exploded inward with a roar of fire and metal, and Elena dropped to one knee behind the negotiation table as debris scattered across the room. The Veilith soldiers opened fire immediately, their NG rifles sending bright pulses of light toward the breach. But the Korath did not enter the way anyone expected. They came through low and fast, tumbling and rolling in random directions that sent the calculated fields of fire cutting through empty. Elena saw 3 Veilith soldiers fall in the first 5 seconds, their bodies crashing to the floor as Korath blades and projectiles found targets that the predictive systems had not accounted for. Thravik was screaming orders, his voice competing with the chaos of combat. But his remaining soldiers were struggling to adjust. Their rifles tracked targets that moved without logic, their systems generating error messages faster than they could process. Get down, Elena shouted at Ambassador Hendricks, pushing him flat against the floor behind the table. She could hear more Korath coming through the breach, their snarling voices mixing with the dying sounds of Veilith soldiers who had trusted technology over instinct. Thravik fired his own weapon at a Korath warrior who charged directly at him with a curved blade raised. But the shot went wide because the alien did not dodge the way the system predicted it would. The blade came down hard, and only a desperate sideways lunge saved Thravik from losing his arm. Elena watched it all from behind the table, her hands resting on her revolvers, and she understood with perfect clarity what was happening. The Veilith had built their entire way of fighting around the idea that combat could be calculated like a math problem, and the Korath were proving them wrong with every chaotic, unpredictable movement. Remaining Veilith soldiers were falling back toward the ambassador's position, their confidence shattered, their perfect systems failing them at the worst possible moment. Elena took a slow breath and let it out even slower Ambassador, she said, her voice calm despite the violence erupting around them. Stay behind cover and do not move until I tell you it is safe. Hendricks looked up at her with wide eyes. What are you going to do? He asked. Elena stood up from behind the table, and for the first time since the attack began, she drew both revolvers in a single smooth motion that felt as natural as breathing something they will not see coming, she said. Thravik saw her step forward and shouted something that was probably meant to be a warning. But Elena was no longer listening to him. She was listening to something older and deeper. A voice inside her head that did not speak in words, but in feelings. In instincts that her great-grandmother had passed down through generations of women who knew that sometimes the only way to survive was to stop thinking and start trusting yourself. The Korath saw her coming. A lone human with 2 primitive weapons, and they probably thought she would be the easiest kill in the room. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The maintenance corridors of Concordia were narrow and dark, designed for repair crews rather than diplomatic delegations fleeing from pirate attacks. Elena moved at the front of the group with one revolver drawn and her free hand trailing along the wall to guide her through sections where the Finda emergency lighting had failed completely. Behind her came Ambassador Hendricks, then Commander Thravik, and the 3 surviving Velis soldiers, all of them moving as quietly as possible while listening for sounds of Korath activity in the surrounding passages. How much further? Hendricks whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of combat and alarms. Elena checked the mental map she had built during her briefing before the negotiation. Security officers always memorized escape routes, and she had walked these corridors during her initial survey of the station. 2 more levels down, and then a long passage to the shuttle bay. She replied, maybe 15 minutes if we do not run into trouble. Thravik moved up beside her, his scales now a dull gray that Elena had learned to recognize as exhaustion or stress. I have been thinking about what I saw in the negotiation chamber, he said, keeping his voice low. My entire career has been built on the certainty of predictive combat. I have led soldiers into battle on 20 different worlds, and we have never lost because our systems always gave us the advantage. Elena kept her eyes forward, scanning the corridor ahead. And now? She asked. Thravik made a sound that might have been a sigh if Velith were capable of sighing. Now I am questioning everything I believed about warfare, he admitted. Watching you fight forced me to consider possibilities I had never allowed myself to consider before. Our reliance on prediction has made us powerful, but it may have also made us vulnerable in ways I did not understand until today. Elena slowed her pace as they approached an intersection, checking both directions before waving the group forward. Can I ask you something about those weapons? Thravik continued, gesturing toward the revolvers at her waist. Elena nodded slightly, most of her attention still focused on the passage ahead. They belonged to my great-grandmother, she explained. She carried them during a conflict on Earth over a century ago. A war fought with weapons that would look primitive even compared to these. When the war ended, she passed them to her daughter, who passed them to her daughter, who passed them to me. Thravik considered this information carefully. A family tradition, he said. We have similar practices among the Veleth. Weapons and armor passed down through generations of warriors. It is more than tradition, Elena said. My great-grandmother taught my grandmother how to shoot, and my grandmother taught my mother, and my mother taught me. The knowledge came with the weapons, not just how to aim and fire, but how to think when everything around you is chaos, and there is no time to calculate or plan. They descended a ladder to the next level, Elena going first to make sure the passage below was clear. The weapons are simple, she continued once everyone had made it down safely. They do not require power cells or targeting computers or any of the systems that can fail when you need them most. They work because the person holding them knows how to use them. And that knowledge cannot be jammed, or hacked, or disrupted by enemy countermeasures. Thravik looked down at his own energy rifle, a weapon that contained more computing power than some small starships. I am beginning to understand, he said quietly. The group continued through the maintenance corridors until they reached a junction where 3 passages met. Elena stopped suddenly and held up her hand, signaling everyone to freeze. She could hear movement ahead, the scraping sound of clawed feet on metal flooring, and the low growling voices of Karth communicating with each other. How many? Thravik whispered. Elena closed her eyes and listened more carefully, separating the individual sounds from the echoes bouncing off the corridor walls. 6. Maybe 7, she replied. They are moving toward us slowly, probably searching for survivors. Thravik started to raise his rifle, but Elena put her hand on the barrel and pushed it down. Not yet, she said. Let me show you something. She moved forward alone, staying close to the wall where the shadows were deepest. And Thravik gestured for his soldiers to hold their positions and watch the Korath squad appeared around a corner ahead. 7 of them spread out across the width of the corridor with weapons drawn. They spotted Elena almost immediately and charged forward with the same chaotic aggression she had seen in the negotiation chamber. But this time, Elena fought differently, adapting to the narrow space instead of the open room. She used the walls as cover, pressing against them and firing from angles that the Korath did not expect. The first 2 fell before they understood what was happening. The third Korath got close enough to swing his blade, and Elena ducked under the attack and fired upward at point-blank range. The fourth tried to circle around her, but found himself trapped between Elena and the wall with nowhere to dodge. She was down to 2 bullets in her right revolver when she saw a target she could not hit directly. Instead of moving for a better angle, she aimed at a metal beam on the ceiling and fired. And the ricochet struck the Korath in the back of the head as it tried to flank her position. The last 2 Korath hesitated, seeing their squad fall so quickly. And that hesitation was the last mistake they ever made. Thravik and his soldiers came forward as Elena finished reloading, their eyes moving across the bodies with the same mixture of awe and confusion that she had seen after the first battle. You used the walls, Thravik observed. You changed your tactics completely from the negotiation chamber. Elena nodded and holstered her weapons. That is the point, she said. I do not have one way of fighting that I use every time. I look at the space around me and the enemies in front of me, and I do whatever feels right in that moment. No system can predict that, because even I do not know what I will do until I am doing it. They continued toward the shuttle bay, moving faster now that they were closer to their destination. Thravik walked beside Elena, his earlier arrogance completely replaced by genuine curiosity. Would you be willing to teach my soldiers? He asked, not to abandon our systems entirely, but to supplement them with the kind of instinct you have demonstrated. I believe our combat doctrine has been incomplete, and what you know could make us stronger. Elena glanced at him and saw something she had not expected. Respect. Earned through action rather than titles or technology. I would be willing, she said. But first, we have to survive this day. They reached the final passage, leading to the shuttle bay, and Elena stopped when she saw the blast doors at the end standing open. Through the gap, she could see the bay itself, a large space filled with emergency transports and maintenance vehicles. She could also see the observation window showing the stars outside. And against those stars floated the dark shape of the Korath warship that had positioned itself to destroy any vessel that tried to escape. We have a problem, Ambassador Hendricks said. Stating what everyone could see, Elena studied the warship for a long moment, and slowly an idea began to form in her mind. An idea that was probably insane but might be just unpredictable enough to work. Maybe not, she said. I think I see a way out. But you are not going to like it. Travik looked at her with his scales shifting to an uncertain shade of yellow. What are you planning? He asked. Elena pointed at a small maintenance pod sitting in the corner of the bay. A vehicle designed for external hull repairs that was barely large enough for one person and had no weapons or defensive systems of any kind. I am going to fly that thing straight at the warship, she said. And I am going to make them forget all about the rest of you. The shuttle bay was quiet, except for the distant hum of the station's life support systems, struggling to keep up with the damage from multiple breaches. Elena walked toward the maintenance pod, while the others stood near the main transport. Trying to understand what she was planning, Commander Travik caught up with her before she reached the small vehicle. This is suicide, he said. And for the first time, Elena heard genuine concern in his voice rather than professional calculation. That warship has targeting systems that can track objects moving at half the speed of light. Your tiny pod will be destroyed before you can do anything useful. Elena turned to face him, and something in her expression made him take a step back. Have you not been paying attention? She asked. Your systems could not predict what I would do in a single room against a handful of enemies. What makes you think the Korath targeting systems will do any better in open space? Travik opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again as he realized what she was suggesting. You are going to fly the way you fight, he said slowly. No patterns, no predictable movements, just pure instinct. Elena nodded and climbed into the maintenance pod, settling into the pilot's seat and powering up the basic control systems. The pod is too small to register as a real threat on their sensors, she explained. They will target me because I am moving toward them, but they will not prioritize me over the transport. When I launch, wait 30 seconds, and then take the transport in the opposite direction as fast as the engines will carry you. Ambassador Hendricks approached the pod with a worried expression. Elena, there has to be another way, he said. You have saved our lives twice already today. You do not need to throw yours away for us. Elena smiled at him. A genuine smile that softened the hard edges she usually showed the world. Survival is not always about certainty, she said. Sometimes it is about making your enemy hesitate for just one moment. And in that moment, everything changes. She sealed the pod's canopy and activated the launch sequence. Watching through the small viewport, as the bay doors began to open in front of her, Travik moved to stand beside the ambassador, his scales shifting through colors that Elena could not interpret. She is either the bravest human I have ever met, he said quietly, or the most insane. The maintenance pod shot out of the bay and into the darkness of space, accelerating toward the Korath warship that loomed against the stars like a predator waiting for prey. Elena gripped the controls and let out a slow breath, clearing her mind of everything except the immediate present. She could see weapons ports opening on the warship's hull as targeting systems locked onto her tiny vessel. The first shot came faster than she expected. A beam of energy that would have vaporized the pod if she had been flying in a straight line. But Elena was not flying in a straight line. She was weaving and dodging and spinning in ways that made no tactical sense whatsoever. The second shot missed by a wider margin, and the third shot missed by even more inside the warship. The Korath captain was screaming at his weapons officers. The targeting computer was generating error messages just like the Valith systems had done, unable to find any pattern in the tiny pod's movements that it could use to predict where the target would be next. Elena flew closer and closer to the warship, and with every second she survived, the Korath captain became more frustrated and more focused on destroying this impossible target that was making a mockery of his advanced technology. He never noticed the main transport launching from the shuttle bay behind him. The transport's pilot pushed the engines to maximum power and flew in a straight line away from the station, using every second of the Korath captain's distraction to put distance between them. Elena saw the transport escape through the corner of her eye, and she allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. The ambassador was safe, and Thravik and his soldiers would live to tell the story of what they had. Witness today now, she just had to survive long enough for the distraction to matter. The Korath captain finally realized he had been tricked. He turned his attention back to the fleeing transport and prepared to order pursuit. But before he could give the command, his sensors lit up with new contacts. A Galactic Union patrol fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly between the warship and the escaping transport. 5 military vessels responding to the distress signal that Concordia had sent when the attack began. The Korath captain had a choice: fight the patrol fleet and probably die, or retreat and live to raid another day. He chose retreat, and Lena watched the warship turn and accelerate away, jumping to faster-than-light speed and disappearing into the vastness of space. She let out a breath she had not realized she was holding and slumped back in her seat. The patrol fleet's lead vessel matched velocity with her tiny pod and opened communications. Maintenance pod. This is the Union vessel Resolute. Please identify yourself and state your condition. Elena laughed, a sound of pure relief and exhaustion. This is Elena Marsh, security officer attached to Ambassador Paul Hendricks. I am uninjured, but I could really use a ride home. 3 weeks later, Elena stood in a garden on Earth, the same garden where her mother had taught her to shoot when she was just a girl. The trees were green, and the air was warm, and everything felt peaceful in a way that space stations never did. She heard footsteps approaching and turned to see Commander Thravik walking toward her. His scales now a calm shade of blue that she had learned meant contentment or friendship. You came a long way, Elena said as he stopped beside her. Thravik reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew a small object made of dark metal, carved with symbols that Elena did not recognize. This is a Velith Combat Commendation, he explained. The highest honor our military can bestow upon a warrior. In 300 years of the Velith Dominion, it has never been given to a non-Velith. He held it out to her, and Elena accepted it with a feeling of humility she rarely experienced. Thank you, she said, turning the commendation over in her hands. But I was just doing my job. Thravik made the sound that she now knew was genuine laughter. You did much more than that, he said. You showed us that our combat theory was incomplete, that all our calculations and predictions meant nothing against someone who trusts their instincts more than any computer. He paused and looked around the garden with curious eyes. The Volith Military Academy has added a new module to our training, he continued. We now teach young soldiers that algorithms can fail, that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is one who cannot be predicted, and that adaptation is just as important as calculation. Elena smiled and gestured toward a target range she had set up at the far end of the garden. I promise to teach you how to shoot, she said. Are you ready to learn? Thravik nodded, and something in his posture reminded Elena of herself as a young girl. Eager to learn the secrets her mother was about to share, she drew one of her revolvers and handed it to him. Grip first. The first lesson is the most important, she said. Stop thinking so much and start trusting yourself. The weapon is just a tool, but your instincts are what will keep you alive. Thravik took the revolver and held it awkwardly, his clawed hands not designed for human weapons. But he adjusted his grip until it felt stable. What is the second lesson? He asked. Elena drew her other revolver and aimed it at the target in the distance. The second lesson is that some things cannot be calculated, she said. They can only be lived. She fired once, and the target shattered in the center. Thravik looked at the destroyed target, then back at Elena, and his scales shifted to a shade of gold that she had never seen before. I think I am beginning to understand, he said. Elena holstered her weapon and put a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of friendship that crossed the boundary between their species. Then let us begin, she said, and under the warm sun of Earth, a human and a Valias stood together and practiced the ancient art of trusting themselves, one shot at a time,